Hello and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. I'm Teniola Shoboale. On the program this week, from COVID-19 to climate change, it's all about the UN General Assembly as leaders address the world virtually. Plus, a second wave of COVID-19 in Europe forces leaders to reimpose restrictions. The United Nations is 75 this year, and its annual General Assembly was meant to be especially big. But what is usually an event packed with world leaders from around the globe looked much different this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. This year's opening event focused on multilateralism, pushing the mantra, multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity.
World leaders came together virtually on Monday, September 21st, to mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Opening the event, the President of the UN General Assembly, Volkan Bozkır, said the world is facing pressing problems and the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted more clearly than ever that countries cannot address these challenges on their own.
The founders recognize that the three pillars of the United Nations, peace and security, development and human rights, are equally important, interrelated and interdependent. One cannot advance without the other, and that is what the UN has been striving for over the past 75 years within the support of you, the member states. Multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity, as we build back better and greener for a more equal, more resilient, and more sustainable world. The United Nations must be at the center of our efforts. Since the UN was established, the world has changed in unimaginable ways. An upgraded UN must respond to these challenges and changes to stay relevant and effective.
Also speaking at the event, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres highlighted the achievements made by United Nations member states over the years.
It took 2 world wars, millions of deaths, and the horrors of the Holocaust for world leaders to commit to international cooperation and the rule of law. That commitment produced results. A third world war, which so many had feared, has been avoided. Never in modern history have we gone so many years without a military confrontation between the major powers. This is a great achievement of which member states can be proud and which we must all strive to preserve.
Guterres, however, warned that many global issues are yet to be dealt with and called on UN member states to rise to the occasion and work together.
Gender inequality remains the greatest single challenge to human rights around the world. Climate calamity looms. Biodiversity is collapsing. Poverty is again rising. Hatred is spreading. Geopolitical tensions are escalating, and nuclear weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. Transformative technologies have opened up new opportunities, but also exposed new threats. And the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the world's fragilities.
In January 2020, the UN Secretary-General launched the UN 75 initiative, not as a celebration, but as the world's largest conversation about current global challenges and the gap between the future we want and where we are headed if the current trend continues.
The opening event came ahead of the annual meeting of world leaders at the United Nations, which kicked off on Tuesday, September the 22nd, with no presidents or prime ministers physically present in New York. All statements were pre-recorded and broadcast in the General Assembly Hall. COVID-19, the elephant in the virtual room, dominated much of the conversation. But for China and the United States, there's no curbing the tension.
The UN Assembly was opened by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who, without naming China or the US, warned that world leaders must do everything to avoid a new Cold War.
I appeal for a stepped-up international effort led by the Security Council to achieve a global ceasefire by the end of this year. We have 100 days, as I said, the clock is ticking. The world needs a global ceasefire to stop all hot conflicts. But at the same time, we must do everything to avoid a new Cold War. We are moving in a very dangerous direction. Our world cannot afford a future where the two largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules and internet and artificial intelligence capacities. A technological and economic divide risks inevitably turning into a geostrategic and military divide, and we must avoid these at all costs.
As we pursue this bright
Despite a
future,
warning, US President Donald Trump used the majority of his speech to directly blame China for the spread of the coronavirus.
we will distribute a vaccine. We will defeat the virus. We will end the pandemic. And we will enter a new era of unprecedented prosperity, cooperation, and peace. As we pursue this bright future, we must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China.
The US president also criticized the World Health Organization, WHO, alleging it to be under the thumb of Beijing.
The Chinese government and the World Health Organization, which is virtually controlled by China, falsely declared that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. Later, they falsely said people without symptoms would not spread the disease. The United Nations must hold China accountable for their actions.
Speaking soon after the US president, Chinese President Xi Jinping warned of the risks of a clash of civilizations and said his country had no intention to enter a Cold War with any country.
We will continue to narrow differences and resolve disputes with others through dialogue and negotiation. We will not seek to develop only ourselves or engage in a zero-sum game. China will continue to work as a builder of global peace, a contributor to global development, and a defender of international law and international order.
President Trump, whose own record on coronavirus is under close scrutiny as the US heads towards elections, has frequently accused Beijing of covering up the virus, saying they could have stopped the disease from spreading. China has called the attacks an unfounded distraction.
COVID-19 vaccines were also on several leaders' minds, as many touted their country's vaccine candidate as a potential solution.
Russian President Vladimir Putin told the United Nations General Assembly that the World Health Organization should be strengthened to coordinate the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic and proposed the Conference on Vaccine Cooperation.
Building on the scientific, industrial and clinical experience of its doctors, Russia has promptly developed a range of test systems and medicines to detect and treat the coronavirus. We are ready to share experience and continue cooperating with all states and international entities, including supplying the Russian vaccine, which has proven to be reliable, safe and effective to other countries.
President Putin also said that Moscow is ready to provide its vaccine free to the United Nations so it could inoculate its staff. In August, Russia became the first country to approve a COVID-19 vaccine called Sputnik V, but international scientists have been skeptical of its safety and effectiveness, as it has not started phase 3 trials when it was approved. Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte used his address to call for universal access to a COVID-19 vaccine.
The world is in the race to find safe and effective vaccine. When the world finds that vaccine, access to it must not be denied nor withheld. It should be made available to all rich and poor nations alike as a matter of policy. The Philippines joins our partners in the ASEAN and the non-aligned movement, and in raising our collective voice, the COVID-19 vaccine must be considered a global public good. COVID-19 knows no border, It knows no nationality. It knows no race. It knows no gender. It knows no age. It knows no creed.
Echoing calls for a vaccine to become made available to all, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres also said no one is safe until everyone is safe.
We are working to advance treatments and therapies as a global public good and backing efforts for a people's vaccine available and affordable everywhere. We know some countries are reportedly making side deals exclusive for their own populations. Such vaccine nationalism is not only unfair, it is self-defeating. None of us is safe until all of us are safe.
From China, the country where the virus is believed to have originated, President Xi Jinping promised it will be defeated. He announced that Beijing would provide an additional $50 million to the United Nations COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan and said his country is making progress on a vaccine. In his UNGA address, US President Donald Trump said the United States is also making strides on a potential vaccine. He said 3 COVID-19 vaccines are in their final stage of clinical trials, adding that his country was mass-producing them in advance so they can be delivered immediately upon arrival.
As world leaders gathered virtually for the 75th United Nations General Assembly debate, African leaders again restated the continent's common positions, which include the reform of the United Nations Security Council. For the African Union, the address was also used to highlight the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent.
Speaking to the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the African Union, AU Chair and South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa called for an economic stimulus package to help African nations devastated by COVID-19 and the suspension of interest payments on Africa's debt.
It is in the spirit of this new global deal that we call on the international community and our international partners to support the rollout of a comprehensive stimulus package for African countries. This will enable African countries to not only mitigate the health impacts of COVID-19, but to aid us in the immense task of rebuilding our shattered economies.
The South African president also urged the United Nations General Assembly to increase representation of African countries on the Security Council and called for swift action against racism.
Particularly leaders from the global...
On his part, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari also stressed his country's contributions to international law and treaties and said it was time to open up Security Council decision-making to African countries.
Mr. President, as we urge and strive for inclusion within our societies, we must also ensure inclusion prevails in our collective action as members of the international community. Nigeria supports the expansion of the United Nations Security Council to reflect the diversity and dynamics of the 21st century. Africa deserves permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council.
The president also called on the international community to do more to eradicate poverty, fight multinational crime, and promote inclusion of African countries in world affairs.
Although much of this year's focus was on the coronavirus pandemic, climate change was also at the forefront. Brazil's president rejected international criticism of his government's environmental policies, accusing foreign media of overhyping fires in the Amazon.
The Amazon rainforest is experiencing its worst rash of fires in 10 years, while the Pantanal wetlands, the world's largest, has the most blazes ever recorded. Environmental advocates blame President Jair Bolsonaro for emboldening illegal ranchers and land speculators who set the fire to land to increase its value for agricultural use. In his speech at the UN General Assembly, the president rebutted the accusations, saying Brazilian agriculture feeds 1 billion people in the world and that the country has the best environmental legislation. Bolsonaro said it was difficult for Brazil to fight the Amazon fires and illegal logging in an area bigger than Western Europe, but was trying to do so with the help of the military. His government has said criticism of its environmental policies are just a cover for protectionism in Europe, where farmers see Brazil as a competitor and businesses have threatened to boycott Brazilian products.
You're still watching Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. As coronavirus infection rates rise across Europe again, experts are concerned another major outbreak is around the corner. The rise comes after a period of unprecedented lockdowns during the first wave, which helped reduce cases and the death rate across the continent.
After successfully tamping down the first surge of infection and death, Europe is now in the middle of a second coronavirus wave as it moves into winter. According to the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, daily case numbers in the European Union and United Kingdom have reached record highs of more than 45,000. The surge comes just after the summer vacation season as workers return to city centres and children go back to school. The World Health Organization has suggested the increase could be partly down to the relaxation of measures and people dropping their guard, and evidence indicates young people are driving the second surge in Europe.
We do have a very serious situation unfolding before us. Weekly cases have now exceeded those reported when the pandemic first peaked in Europe in March. In the spring and early summer, we were able to see the impact of strict lockdown measures. Our efforts, our sacrifices paid off. In June, cases hit an all-time low. The September case numbers, however, should serve as a wake-up call for all of us.
The WHO also says current increases in the number of new COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations is a worrying trend as the flu season is fast approaching, making it more difficult to distinguish between ordinary flu infections and the coronavirus. The European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control said on Monday, September 21st, that Spain had 300 cases of COVID-19 per 100,000, the highest in Europe, followed by the Czech Republic, France, Luxembourg, Malta, Belgium, Hungary and Austria.
Leaders have raised fears over the pressure that hospitals could face in coming months. But already medical officials in France and Spain are crying out for help.
Marseille is at the epicenter of a renewed surge in the spread of coronavirus cases throughout France. Intensive care wards in the Mediterranean city's public hospitals are full, and so this clinic is handling the spillover. For Nathalie Roche, a nurse in the clinic's COVID-19 unit, the experience of lessons learned during the first wave brings reassurance, and there are none of the acute shortages of face masks and gloves that compounded the stress of the job in the spring.
The number of patients is increasing more and more day by day. It's true that we already know what to expect. We know how to handle the care a little better. So we are more at ease, but psychologically, of course, it's still an extra weight.
Some of France's biggest cities outside of Paris, including Marseille, Lyon, Bordeaux, have imposed new COVID restrictions in an attempt to slow the virus spread and reduce the number of intensive care admissions. Director David Ferrat had almost cleared his hospital's intensive care ward of COVID-19 patients during the September lull in new cases. Now the private unit is filling fast again, and he can barely conceal his frustration.
What is tiring is not doing our jobs, it's the return to the second wave, because people did not respect social distancing. And that's what is serious. Those who don't wear their masks properly, those who don't wear their masks, those who are not careful. That's the problem today. We take risks with our staff. We take risks with everyone because these people do not respect the rules.
Over in Spain, hospitals in Madrid, which accounts for a third of all infections in the country, are also experiencing increasing pressure as the spread of coronavirus continues to rise.
We are saturated with people who need health care and patients that need care. We're doing the best we can, but we need more health workers. We need more resources.
Current contagion levels in the Spanish capital exceed 1,000 per 100,000 inhabitants, and some hospitals have already reported that they have had to cancel pre-programmed surgeries. More than 1/4 of all Madrid's hospital beds and 1/3 of all intensive care units are now occupied by COVID-19 patients. Regional authorities on Monday, September 21st, implemented limited lockdowns affecting about 850,000 people. But officials say, if necessary, a broader lockdown in the region could be imposed.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson's early Christmas present to Britain is 6 months of fresh restrictions. Faced with a surge in coronavirus cases across the UK, the Prime Minister has announced new measures to combat the virus, including a 10 p.m. curfew for restaurants and bars and restrictions on how people can socialise.
After government scientists cautioned that deaths may soar without urgent action, Prime Minister Boris Johnson stopped short of another full lockdown, as he did in March, but says further action could be taken if the disease was not suppressed.
I want to stress that this is by no means a return to the full lockdown of March. We're not issuing a general instruction to stay at home. We will ensure that schools, colleges and universities stay open because nothing is more important than the education, health and well-being of our young people. We will ensure that businesses can stay open in a COVID-compliant way. However, we must take action to suppress the disease.
Pubs, bars and other hospitality venues in England are now restricted to table service only and will have to close at 10 p.m.
The law-abiding majority.
Rules on mask wearing and workplace have been tightened, with enforcement stepped up and tougher fines imposed for breaking the rules.
The penalty for failing to wear a mask or breaking the rule of 6 will now double to £200 for a first offence. We will provide the police and local authorities with the extra funding they need, a greater police presence on our streets, and the option to draw on military support where required to free up the police.
The Prime Minister says the country has reached a perilous turning point after the number of daily virus infections had almost quadrupled in a month. Testing in the country has increased, but so has the proportion of people testing positive.
Let's head over to China's Santa Workshop now, where sellers are fretting over how to save Christmas. The Chinese city of Yiwu is where about 80% of the world's Christmas goods are produced. But the coronavirus pandemic has slashed demand from international buyers, leaving the city's factories and vendors little to celebrate this year.
At the Yiwu Christmas factory in eastern China, workers are stitching and testing out Santa Claus toys, checking that they play Christmas tunes at the press of a button. But the jingles are the only seasonal cheer in the factory. September is usually one of the busiest months of the year, but this year is different.
Because of the coronavirus pandemic, orders for this year decreased a lot. In terms of our number of new clients, they basically haven't increased this year compared with last year. Orders from our usual clients decreased by almost half, so the epidemic has had a huge effect on us.
Vendors and manufacturers in Yiwu are at pains to try to save Christmas this year, as the coronavirus pandemic upends international business travel forcing countries including China to place stringent curbs on entry into the country by foreigners.
I think overall it's fair to say that probably the entire business is down by half. I think if you look at what's happened, most of the business that runs through Yiwu is still done face-to-face. So you have big buyers coming to visit the market and make face-to-face deals with the vendors. They can't do that this year because nobody can travel to China. So I think that's one problem.
Offloading excess stock to Chinese e-commerce platforms is not a profitable option either, given that the holiday is not traditionally celebrated in China. Using cross-border sites such as Amazon or AliExpress is also not feasible, as large quantities need to be sold to justify shipping costs. For sellers in Yiwu, which is home to China's largest small commodity markets and produces 80% of Christmas items exported globally, they can only wait and hope for a Christmas miracle.
And that's the program this week. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember that you can catch up with all our top stories on channelstv.com. I'm Teniola Shobowale. See you next time.